Our second panel of the day is the use and misuse of artificial intelligence to manage dangerous information. I was thinking over lunch about what Bob might have been thinking about artificial intelligence. I think he certainly would have been worried about ChatGPT in the writing process. He was, after all, somebody whose preferred technology for writing was to use a dictaphone. But this panel will look at the trade-offs and implications of using new information technology to manage national security information. And again, I will introduce our moderator and then turn things over to our esteemed panelists. Sue Halpern is our moderator. We're thrilled to have her here today. She's a highly accomplished and praised journalist and author. She's the author of 8 books, including, I think the most recent one is Summer Hours at the Robbers Library, and the one whose title I most get a giggle out of, A Dog Walks into a Nursing Home. She's a scholar in residence at Middlebury College, where she runs the Middlebury Fellowship in Narrative Journalism. She's a former staff writer at The New Yorker and a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books. I'm sure many of us in this room have read quite a bit of her work. And she writes at the intersection of politics and technology, making her, of course, an important authority on today's panel and an ideal person to lead us through this topic. Thanks so much, Sue, for being here, and thanks to all of our panelists. Thanks.
So the first thing I'm going to do here is ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. So we'll start with Hanna.
Hey everyone, I'm Hanna Wallach. I'm a partner research manager at Microsoft, and I've been at Microsoft for about 10 years now. Before that, I was a professor at UMass Amherst. I'm a computer scientist by training, and I've been in the space of AI and machine learning for over 20 years at this point, so way before this current explosion of everything that's happening. Over those 20 years, my research has gone from being around kind of developing machine learning technologies, so pretty standard machine learning stuff, to then working with social scientists and journalists to develop new machine learning technologies that would help them answer questions that they were interested in answering. And so that's what I would call computational social science. And then over the past maybe 9 years or so, my research is really focused on what I would now call responsible AI. So things like fairness, accountability, and transparency in the context of AI systems. Within Microsoft, I do some amount of research, academic research. I also run a small applied science team that bridges research and practice, and that focuses specifically on measuring a bunch of different responsible AI risks caused by AI systems. And yeah, that's me. I'm excited to be here. Thank you all.
Camille.
Hi, everybody. My name is Camille François. I've been working on the sort of use and misuse of new technology for 15 years or so in a practice that we tend to call trust and safety, which means within tech companies, tech platform, the team is responsible for detecting when misuse and abuse happen and for mitigating these types of harms. In this context, of course, tools like content moderation play a very important role. And this year, there's been a very big acceleration. As Hanna said, those are trends that are coming from way further, but this year there's been a big acceleration in both the potential of using AI to help some of the trust and safety efforts, notably to help improve content moderation, but also we've seen a lot of new types of abuse and new misuses of tech platforms that are fueled by AI. And so I stand sort of at that intersection trying to figure out how that space will be reshaped by AI. And I'm very grateful to be an IGP faculty affiliate and in researcher here at SIPA.
Great, thank you. My name is Carmen Medina, and I retired in 2010 from a 32-year career at CIA. I was a colleague of Peter Clement, and we were analysts and eventually managers of analysts. I've co-written a book called Rebels at Work. Forget the rest of the title now, but it accurately, or at least so, more or less accurately captures my career at CI, so I was a bit of a heretic and a troublemaker. And I think I don't have a whole lot of qualifications to be on this panel, but one of them is probably is that when the internet arrived in the mid-1990s at CIA, I was one of a handful of people who were saying, we gotta adjust to the internet because it's gonna change everything for all knowledge organizations. And took a long time for the CIA to come to grips with that. And if I were at CIA right now with artificial intelligence, I'd be saying the same thing. And I think at least this time around, the intelligence community is more interested in artificial intelligence. It's faster to take it up. So that's who I am.
Great, thank you guys. So I think that we can all agree that the system of keeping state secrets is broken. Too many records get classified, and I think that's because it's the path of least resistance. Matthew Connolly, who may be here, but I don't know him, there you are, wrote a great book called The Declassification Engine. And in that book, he has a statistic that just will kind of blow your mind, which is that the National Archives has a backlog of 600 million unexamined presidential records. And he also says that it will take something like 250 years for the staff to go through the records of George W. Bush alone. This is just, one president, one set of records, and as digital technology increases, there's more and more there are more and more records. So this is an exponential problem. So we could be here to talk about using digital technology to fix that particular system. But in fact, I think that our remit is to talk about the prospect of using AI, machine learning, to clean up that mess and to rationalize it going forward. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that I think all of you agree that the system needs to be fixed. But I'm wondering if, as we think about this, should we be thinking about using digital technology to do that work? And I think before you guys answer that question, this is a university, so we have to define our terms. So there are different levels of declassification. There's the sort of one that we somewhat think about, which is when an authorized person in the government decides that information is no longer going to harm national security. Next kind is when information is declassified because someone determines that it may actually harm, there's a potential for harm of national security, but it is in the public interest to declassify it. And the third kind, and it may be the kind that we're really talking about here, is this automatic declassification that has been codified in law and says that after 25 years, certain information is automatically declassified, except we know that that's actually not happening. We also know that there are exceptions to that automatic declassification. So my first question is to all of you. Would you agree that in general, not talking about the specifics because we'll get into that, but in general, should we be thinking about using machine learning, generative AI more generally, to address this problem? We'll just go down.
Yes, I think that this is absolutely a topic that is worth exploring. In my own case, back in 2010 or so, I started collaborating with a political scientist who was very interested in the government classification system, and through that got access to a large number of previously classified documents that had then been declassified, and we began a project that focused on basically combining ideas from topic modeling, so these are methods for analyzing the content of documents, with ideas from survival analysis, so these are methods for predicting durations of things, to see if we could do some kind of more granular prediction of when and why documents might be declassified. That's actually how I know Matt Connolly, is through that work from many, many years ago. And ultimately, that work was interesting. We were able to do sort of a large-scale exploratory analysis that revealed certain patterns. We didn't pursue developing a predictive system of sorts, but there's clearly a lot of questions and a lot of things that can be investigated in this space, and it is probably worth our while as a community to do so. I will also say that as somebody who works on responsible AI, I also don't think we should just blindly be saying, great, let's throw AI at this, without thinking through what do we mean, how will AI be used, what will it be used to do, and doing some very, very careful measurement and experimentation to really get a sense on strengths, weaknesses, characteristics, limitations, and stuff like that.
Camille, I imagine you come up from this a little bit from a different perspective. So.
No, I would actually say I agree. The question of, will folks want to do that is always yes. I think right now we're surfing the trend of everything wants to be solved with AI, and that's okay. And I think Anna's asking the right question, right? That it's about what are the real implications of using the current state of these technologies to change these processes, and what is going different if, for instance, you use AI to do a declassification process. And the right way to answer that question is, of course, to test it, to do a small pilot, and to look at, all right, in which ways inherent biases in these systems may manifest in these outputs for the decisions that will have been made differently in those systems than human decisions. What is the nature of what we would call false positives or false negatives? What is the nature of the decisions that result in different outcomes? And what are the democratic implications of these differences? I think that we have to ground the answer to these questions in those experimentation, and we have to look at these experimentation asking, again, what are those biases changing in the outputs of this process, and what are the consequences for democracy and for national security of the biases and the way they express themselves in those new decisions.
So people are already piloting using AI to solve the classification problems. I know that the State Department has a project going on with diplomatic cables, and that the State Department project manager believes that they reduced the need for people time by, 60% or something like that as a result of this first pilot project. So, and it clearly, it's a classic example, the 25-year declassification program, of legislation that was enacted with just blissful ignorance of the physics of what they were asking people to do. And this law was enacted before the internet went into full swing, and so the two have never been reconciled. So it's already being tried. There is absolutely no way to get on top of this program using humans. So we will either continue to be in violation of the law, or we will find some machine learning kind of way to do it. There is no, or AI kind of way to do it. There is no third option. I will say, and I want to throw in this little anecdote somewhere, and I'm going to do it here at the start, that people are already, I've heard of people already using AI to try to solve the redaction problem in FOIA requests. So last year, I'm not going to say this person's name, but this person told me a story, and a very reputable person, of how they had taken a bunch of FOIA redacted documents with, the black lines in it, fed it into an AI engine and asked AI to fill in the blanks. And clever, and this person reported that the AI did a particularly credible, no way probably to tell that it's accurate, obviously, but credible job in creating the complete document. And just think of the disinformation potential of that scenario.
That's a good point. In 2020, there was a report from the Public Interest Declassification Board saying that the Office of the Director of National Intelligence had the expertise to build a system of classification using machine learning and AI. But we've also read that private companies such as Palantir have proposed that they can build the proper engine to do this work, that they can turn rules into tools, I think is one of the phrases that I've read that Palantir said, and they can limit the hallucinations of generative AI, and that they will also keep humans in the loop. So I want to ask you two the first question, and then the second question is going to go down the line. And the first question is, do we want private companies and proprietary algorithms to be in charge of state secrets?
That's a great question. And I think for me, this really gets at the issue of who do we want developing our AI systems. I think when I look at the complexities of something like the challenges involved in designing an AI system to assist with the declassification process, what really stands out to me is that I think this is a multi-stakeholder issue. It's not clear to me that any single stakeholder group is going to be able to do a good job by themselves. So it feels to me as if this probably is a multi-stakeholder issue. We clearly need people on the government side to be involved, and yet there is benefit to having the expertise from technology companies involved as well. So from my perspective, I think that the most effective systems will be developed via this sort of multi-stakeholder approach. What will that look like? I don't know exactly. I think this is really challenging. As soon as you turn anything into as soon as anything is a multi-stakeholder challenge, it becomes very, very difficult to actually make progress and kind of get things done. But I think that probably is going to be the most promising approach there. At the end of the day, I do think it's important that folks in government understand the technology and understand what it is doing and what it is not doing, and sort of how the outputs can and should be interpreted. At the same time, I think it's really important for people within the tech industry to understand the government classification system extremely deeply and all of the expertise and human expertise that's embedded in there. So taking all of that together, I think we are all going to benefit if this is jointly tackled. But again, I don't know exactly what that would look like.
Yeah, I think there are at least two questions there are many questions in your question, but I'll try to take two of them. The first one is, do we want private companies, private tech companies involved so deeply in the business of handling sensitive and classified material? And I think the answer to that is it's already the case, and it's been the case for decades. It's definitely a growing tension. We've seen, I think this week, Google fired dozens of people for their own protest and the way their own engineering projects was involved in specifically in conflict zones and in war. And so there's definitely something there that already exists, and that's a known tension. Now, what does AI change to that equation? And sort of getting back to what Hanna's saying, which parts of this problem feel new and require a type of collaboration between notably tech platforms and governments that we don't know how to handle? And I think part of an answer to that question is exactly what Carmen was talking about, and it's this tricky question of hallucination. And I think we might just take 1 second to talk about it, because I'm pretty sure it's going to come back a lot. What we call hallucination in the context of a generative AI system is when an AI will confidently share a piece of information that is inaccurate. And we now refer to this as a hallucination. To your point, tech makers such as Palantir are working on reducing hallucinations. This is why people can confidently have redacted material magically unredacted. But the very concept of hallucination is a little bit tricky because what we're talking about, generative AI, is a prediction engine. And so in this regard, you can almost think about it saying hallucination is not a bug, it's a feature, right? The whole point of generative AI is to absorb an enormous amount of information and to predict what is most likely to happen given either the information that's provided or the question that's provided. So with regard to the use case that you shared, here's a redacted document. What's the most likely thing underneath the redaction? That's actually exactly what the machine is designed for. And when it comes up with inaccurate information, you might say it's a hallucination, or you can say, that is a good use of statistics. That is indeed highly possible. It just happens to be untrue. And so by sort of us really focusing on this idea of we must manage hallucination, we're going a little bit against the machine because really the machine is a prediction engine and a hallucination is just a valid prediction that happens to be untrue at that very moment in time. And when that happens in the context of sensitive material, you end up with this difficult dynamic where the only people who, if I understand the rules correctly, are able to tell you if something is indeed classified or not, are not tech employees without access to clearances. And the way Silicon Valley currently handle this problem of hallucination is through a process which we call red teaming, which has been borrowed from cybersecurity and information security, where essentially a bunch of people, including at Microsoft, take machines and we try to break them. We try to make them say things that they're not supposed to say. And that process could also result in taking a system, let's say a chatbot, and trying to figure out, is it going to give me information that it's not supposed to give me, either because that information exists in the training data or because it just should not be generating this information. And the problem is right now, this is done within tech companies, but you need an expertise that's not within the tech companies to actually assess whether the result that you're looking at is or is not dangerous, is or is not classified. And this is where I think, Hanna, the dynamic that you're pointing at really sort of falls down, right? Like right now, we have a method of testing dangerousness, but frankly, the two sets of expertise that must come together for that method to produce the outcomes that we need just don't live in the same room.
Yeah. And they're not necessarily scalable. I mean, we don't red team the whole world, right? I mean we could.
This is a challenge for AI in general. How are we going to scale up testing? Yep.
And what happens if the result is, well, yes, a chatbot is able to generate information that's harmful? At what time do you say, well, it's actually so harmful that the government will go out of its way for this technology to not be, shared in the mainstream, right? Like we also don't really have a clear set of agreed upon guidelines for what we will do if X happens.
Yeah. I also want to note that there's different ways that AI might be used as part of the government classification system. So it might be to predict, redacted text or something like that, as we were discussing. The other thing you can do is you can use a generative AI system as a classifier, so as a predictor of predicting particular labels, in this case maybe declassify or keep classified. In that scenario, if you're going to use an AI system to make those kinds of predictions, you're going to take your pre-trained large language model, you're going to fine-tune it for that particular prediction task, and then you're going to use it to make predictions. But when you do that fine-tuning, you will need examples of both documents that should be declassified or are declassified, and ones that should not be. And if you're looking, therefore, at information that is and should be kept classified, that is going to require folks in the government space to be involved in. That is not something that, that can be handled sort of outside of that government classification system context as well.
Right. So I wanted to ask Carmen. So
Yes.
So the declassification board said that essentially that the government has the expertise to create these systems. You're our government representative. What do you think?
Okay, well, I think this is the moment where I should say what I forgot to say in my introduction of myself, which is I was appointed to the Public Interest Declassification Board at the end of last year, and but therefore was not a part of the 2020 report. And I spent a lot of time in my career at CIA sort of as kind of being an IT-friendly analyst. You know, I was one of the ones that was very interested in all the ways that IT could support analysis. And I experienced several programs at CIA, at other agencies, at DNI, designed to bring in some technology solution for, you know, the analyst workspace. And I did not experience any that went particularly well. Okay, so I have to be honest about that. What I found was a routine problem was that the requirements process in government took so long that by the time we were finally implementing what 3 or 4 years ago had been a cutting edge solution, technology had gone way past what we thought was cutting edge and was moving on to something else. And I don't know, you know, I find, when the report said that the government or the DNI had the expertise, I would hope that they would distinguish that as the expertise to oversee it and sort of set requirements. But I think there's no way, as the two of you have mentioned, there's no way that this can be done without a public-private partnership. Now, I will say that there are huge bodies of classified information, or now declassified information, available that can be worked with to train an AI engine. So the CIA, which for years did not put its declassified documents on the interwebs, several years ago, did actually put, I think, like 14 million documents on the internet, and it is technically available. It may be in PDF files, which is unfortunate, but it is available for training. And as I see how AI could work, and I welcome other comments, but as I see it, one approach would be whenever you have a new corpus of documents that need to be declassified, you just compare it against the existing declassified set and alert the human in the loop as to, okay, there's like 98% overlap between this set and the ones you've already declassified. Cross your fingers that those declassification decisions were correct, because we all know they're not 100% correct. We know this. And then say, okay, the new information available in this new corpus is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and you decide. Now that seems to me, as a non-IT person, something that is straightforward and doesn't get into questions of sort of what is the underlying ideology or value statement of the algorithm. And I'll stop there.
You know, I write a lot about elections. And one of the things that people like to say about the security of our election system is that it's decentralized and therefore it's hard to hack the whole system. And one of the things I was thinking about when I was reading about the backlog of documents was that in a kind of perverse way, the fact that this system is so broken, the fact that so much of this is analog, that it might actually thwart some kinds of cybersecurity breaches. But I'm wondering, from your perspective, particularly Camille, maybe, but all of you, what are the cybersecurity implications of having a digitized system of both classification and declassification?
That's a great and complicated question. And, you know, I think a lot of our conversations on AI force us to reckon with what's a tech problem and what's an AI problem, and particularly what's a new generative AI problem. And unfortunately, foreign adversaries want to hack into anything that may either compromise the integrity or the perception of integrity of election is not a generative AI problem, and we know that. Our ability to deal with that, to create some robustness around, the election infrastructure, both the public and private part, and to think about it as critical infrastructure is also not a generative AI problem. What feels new here is I think a difficult question, because some of it is this idea of hallucination. Some of it might be the extension of surfaces that are poorly protected within which we're going to infuse new information. Carmen, I think that the workflow that you described is really interesting. It goes back to the point that Hanna was saying. If you do exactly what you just said, the machine that you will create will want to declassify everything all the time, because it will only have seen examples of material that you will have said, and therefore this should be declassified. So indeed, it is the case that if you do want to have anything that can be the discriminator in the terms we use between something that should or shouldn't be, it should indeed be exposed to a lot of both material that should remain classified, but also to all the underlying reasons why that is the case. Otherwise, it will just be trigger happy and want to declassify the world, which will be fun to see, but will have other implications. So, the one thing you can do with it, though, which will be interesting, and this comes to your question on election, is if there is a very large database of declassified material, you can train a bot to write like an analyst, and that would be fun for all of our students who want to write papers in this way. That's absolutely very doable. But I think really what we're saying here is, with all the things that could go wrong in the overlap between cybersecurity and election, there's a lot of also questions on information operations. And will those new generative AI tools enable our adversaries and people who again want to question the integrity of election to make fake leaks or faked CIA analyst memos, or to sort of create more effective campaigns to destabilize? I think that might be one of the new edges, but otherwise it just feels like we're back to this question of what do we need to have proper cybersecurity defenses for the complex set of election critical infrastructure, both public and private.
So I wasn't thinking specifically of elections. I was thinking about the fact that we have a broken analog system for classification. And now we're talking about digitizing it. It's got to live somewhere. How do we make sure that it lives there securely? How do we not now open ourselves up to even more potential threats by doing something that we are looking at as sort of trying to minimize, national security harms and be more transparent and more democratic? So how do we do that once we start digitizing and putting this somewhere that might be available to adversaries? That's kind of what the cybersecurity.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's already somewhere. It's already on a bunch of servers, and it's already in need of more investment in securing all that set of infrastructure. So it's a very true and valid question. Here, this is one in which I don't think that generative AI changes materially, unless, and this has happened, back when ChatGPT first arrived, unless you have some trigger-happy people and analysts in every building who suddenly turn to ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude and all the models on Hugging Face to sort of input information that they shouldn't be spreading around, which is sort of new and different. And that definitely happened. There was this really fun leaked memo from the UK government telling people hey, please stop putting classified information into all the chatbots. We know it's fun, but really, please don't do it. Which I think made everybody chuckle, because absolutely every organization under the sun was doing the same thing, including all the tech companies saying, stop putting the customer data, stop putting AC proof document, just please stop putting sensitive information into chatbots. So that felt like a very new extension of the surface of things to be protected.
And maybe I just want to jump in for a second. I think there's, if I'm understanding the question correctly, we have this largely human system at the moment. We're talking about introducing a technology into that system. That is going to come with risks associated with it. When I look at those risks, I think those risks fall into a bunch of different buckets. And I think, as you were getting at, one bucket of risks is around security. We've now created this system that could be a target for people to attack, to try and get access or to influence the government classification system. I'm not a security expert, so I can't comment on even really the nature of that risk or what possible mitigations you would want to put in place. But it is clear to me that that would be something that folks who do think a lot about computer security from a variety of different perspectives would have to tackle. Then there's other risks which I think are less, maybe less technological, but I think are still worth thinking through as well. So, declassifying documents is this very kind of to some extent, subjective task that humans do. And so I have concerns about saying that we should be letting an AI system do this in a completely automated fashion. And I think that raises questions as well. So what do we do then about making sure that we have the right human oversight in even operating this technological machinery? How do we make sure that there are humans in the loop? So, so I'm a researcher, but I work at Microsoft, and Microsoft has put out a whole bunch of generative AI systems over the past couple of years, or year, I guess, and has been very deliberately calling them co-pilots to emphasize the fact that these are not supposed to be things that are just sort of running wild in an automated fashion. These are supposed to be the co-pilot to a human, not the pilot itself. And so I think these are some of the questions that we'll have to grapple with. Of course, there's also the question of whenever you introduce a technology, there's the potential for humans to over-rely on that technology and to stop questioning the decisions that it's making. Some of that can be mitigated with user interface choices and even process choices around it. But these are risks that we're not currently facing right now with a largely human system.
I think one of the issues on co-piloting is speed. So, machines work very quickly, humans don't. And so how does the human keep up with the machine decisions? I think that's a really hard thing to navigate.
Particularly when the thinking behind the machine decision is perhaps not apparent, right? So I think that's one of the potential weaknesses of AI is that it's more difficult to interrogate the AI engine than to interrogate the human who made the mistake. So I'm not sure, please correct me if that's wrong, but
actually, for generative AI, so what I'm about to say has a caveat. So
Okay.
I'll say what I'm going to say, and then I'll give you the caveat. But if you're using an LLM, let's say as a predictor, as a
Right.
classifier, and you ask it to make a prediction, you can also ask it for its reasoning.
Okay.
Now, the caveat is that reasoning
Could be wrong.
could be wrong,
Could be
wild,
hallucination.
could be
hallucination.
exactly.
Yeah.
But I think it's really interesting nonetheless because by the human engaging with that reasoning and thinking, does this make sense to me? Is this plausible? Is this, I think it's just another tool for the human to use when making these kinds of decisions.
Yeah. So I wanted to make a point on the cyber or security of this large AI declassification engine. So what you will be hacking, presumably, is declassified material. And so I believe there are nefarious scenarios you could come up with. So for example, by having all this information rapidly declassified, so as a result, it will be that much more current, right? It'll be much more relevant to today's environment. You might be giving adversaries techniques to sort of spoof us and mimic us and inject this information more easily into the environment. But for the most part, I guess, I think we've dug this hole and we're stuck in it. We're in a digital world. Everything is digital. And whatever risks attached to that digital world are the risks, are just our new risk environment. And there's always been risks. There's always going to be risks. So you just sort of have to sit in the hole you've dug, basically.
That's a much more elegant rendition of
No.
the point I was trying to make,
No.
yes.
No.
And I was going to say, I love also that, you said, what if I did have all these material, and what can a machine do? And I think so far we've been focused on the sort of like act of making that recommendation. Anna, you said like it shouldn't be a decision, right? It shouldn't be remain classified or declassified. It should be a recommendation to an analyst. The other thing, of course, that we're not talking about is everything else current generative AI can do on a large corpus of data. That includes things like bundling a set of documents. Hey, all these documents, they sound very similar. That includes things like translating. That could include very fun things like, hey, given that this is all the declassified material, we have identified a corpus of document that very much are exactly redundant here, and so you wouldn't really be adding anything new. You still want to check that, but there's a whole series of things that here I think are like a newfound playground for anybody dealing with large corpuses of document. There are a lot of other caveats and shortcomings of this, particularly, of course, when it comes to translation, which is another thing that's very top of mind for analysts using documents in any context, because to our initial point about hallucination, and that was a weird one to me when I first found out about it, large language models really think they can speak any languages. And so, for instance, because they're usually trained on very large corpuses of everything that can be found on the internet, they would have some exposure to languages, even a little bit, and instead of saying, well, I just can't pull off Urdu, I have only seen a very small corpus, they will actually just provide completely hallucinated translation. And so it's this interesting question of, you have a very powerful set of tools that could be applied to very large corpuses of document, which at any point of the workflow may completely hallucinate and overstate its own capability. What type of analytical thinking does one need to develop in order to properly govern this and put it to good use?
So I wanted to make one point, may I?
Go for it.
Just as I've been listening, of something that AI could do that we haven't been talking about. So the declassification system has a huge volume problem, but the declassification system has a huge consistency problem, where thousands of mistakes are made by humans every year in declassifying, inconsistencies, mistakes. So what if we took a really well-behaved AI engine, really a nice one that we like?
One that Hanna made.
Yeah, and actually asked it to come up with the declassification guidelines based, kind of make our declassification guidelines more consistent by actually analyzing what's been declassified, analyzing the original classified work, and going, these are the mistakes you consistently make, and you need a different kind of process to avoid making those mistakes. I don't know if that made any sense, but it's kind of like use AI to reverse engineer our declassification guidelines.
I think one of the potential dangers of that would be, because there are mistakes made, because there are redundancies, and we're training the AI on what's already happened, we might be training it badly.
Yes, I think that's a huge mistake. I mean, a huge risk, no matter which road you take.
Right, exactly.
I think I think there's another potential opportunity here, which is humans might give different answers about whether or not to declassify a document for all kinds of reasons. It might be that one of those humans is making a mistake. It might just be that humans themselves disagree and are interpreting sort of guidelines very differently. I think this is often the case with very subjective tasks, or tasks that are fundamentally human, is that different humans can interpret those tasks differently. So I think there are opportunities here to come up with guidelines that are specific, and then to do experiments with humans to see the extent to which they agree and disagree. And if humans are disagreeing wildly, then probably an AI system is not going to help with that, because this seems, in that scenario, it seems likely that the issue is that the decision that the humans are being asked to make is about a concept that is fundamentally contested.
And what you're getting at, which is, something that is, I think will be discussed later on this afternoon, is that, it's basically, the whole classification process is highly flawed from the beginning, and now you're asking either humans or AI to fix what was, to fix what was broken from the beginning, and it's like an impossible task.
But I think there's an opportunity here, and I think possibly, I might be wrong, so let's take this with a grain of salt, but I think the opportunity is, if we do have some set of guidelines, then can we give those guidelines to an AI system and see kind of what it does with them? Can we give those guidelines to humans and see what they do with them? If we're getting wild disagreement, that suggests that the guidelines are not sufficiently specific.
Right.
So that suggests that there's more specificity needed. And so I think there's then an iterative loop of actually studying how consistently guidelines can be applied and making them more and more specific until humans are no longer disagreeing so much, and until humans and the machine are no longer disagreeing so much. So I think there might be an opportunity here. Again, I might be wrong, so let's take it with that caveat. But I think it could serve as a lever or a way of probing the existing system and saying, can we address some of these challenges within it?
Hanna, can I take a weird detour here? What you're describing is exactly what the entire field of content moderation is currently facing. Because we have human moderators that are in charge of applying sometimes very vague guidelines, such as, is this hate speech? And we have a lot of people who are experimenting with generative AI's ability to make those decisions. And what we're doing is exactly what Hanna described, right? Like, we're having human moderators which are trained with specific guidance that explains, this is what we mean by hate speech. This is what we mean in this context. Oh, this is something that happened yesterday that you should know about when you evaluate hate speech. And we're trying to figure out if machines produce widely different results. And unfortunately, in this experiment, what we are learning is that the way you write guidelines for humans is extraordinarily different from the way you write guidelines for large language models. And so I think it will also ask the question of what type of guidelines do we want to write and for whom? Because as much as I would love to be in a world in which a great guideline is a great guideline, whether it's for a robot or for a human, I think that the early experiments that we've been running on things that are fairly similar suggest that a great guideline for a large language model is not a good guideline for a human to work with, and a great guideline that reduces the errors that the humans make might not actually get us anywhere with large language models. So that, I think, is something that's emerging that should help us think how we want to tackle this opportunity space.
But I think even before we talk about that, we have to talk about who's making up the guidelines. Who's in charge of that? How do you prevent certain kinds of algorithmic biases? How do you prevent, at what point does politics enter into any of these conversations? Do we know that? Do we know that we can avoid political influences when we're coming up with guidelines? And who is it that comes up with those guidelines, and how are they written?
Well, it's kind of the same questions that you apply to why are we classifying things? What's the point of it? Mm-hmm. Often, something only needs to be classified for like 2 days, right? You're gonna do X 2 days from now, and you want to keep it a secret, but now it's classified kind of in perpetuity until someone takes an action or the 25 years comes up. So, and I feel sometimes like I'm in this panel that we're like stuck in a labyrinth or a maze because we're trying to walk back decisions that are flawed and a process that is flawed from the very beginning. I mean, I will say this, that I think societies built on secrecy and controlling institutions are no longer an optimal model. We've kind of scienced our way and technologied our way out of those societies working anymore, but you just can't come to grips with it. I know that wasn't helpful, but it was really good.
It was extremely helpful.
I think it's helpful. I think flawed technology is unlikely to fix a flawed process, and ultimately that's what we're trying to do.
At the end of the day, technology doesn't exist in a vacuum. None of our systems are purely technical. They're socio-technical. They exist within a societal context. They are developed by people who live within a society and all of the different structures within society. And so it's therefore a mistake to think of them as being these purely technical objects that will somehow get us out of a societal mess.
Right.
Rather, they are absolutely part of that societal context and should be viewed as such.
It's not very healthy to let machines think that they can do things better than we can. I think that's not a path we want to go down.
They will tell you that, though.
Yes.
But if we can't if we can't fix the societal issues first, how are we going to build systems? I mean, won't they inherently be flawed just because we haven't fixed those systems first?
I think it's about the understanding of the flaws in the system and of the impact that result from applying these flawed systems to the specific decisions we're making. And so, for instance, here questions that are valid could be, what is the impact of a poorly made declassification decision, and is this impact augmented in any way by the flaws that we know about those AI systems, and what types of biases that it bring into this impact? And so, for instance, systems that have early on experimented with purely automating decisions via machine learning that have included things like sentencing decision in the justice system, very quickly it became very apparent that this was a terrible idea. That not only the biases were expressing themselves in ways that we could measure, see, but also the actual impact on people's lives were completely intolerable. That is, all of that calculus is different whether you're using, ML systems to decide whether today we're eating bananas or apples. Like in that case, that might be just a fun ride for everybody for a week, right? So I think it's really about always answering those questions.
And I think that's actually a really good example, because what ended up happening was that some of these kinds of algorithmic systems for predicting bail and stuff like that were used. People then did a bunch of investigation to figure out whether the decisions that were being made were biased in various different ways. People found that they were, according to some definitions. There was then a whole host of discussion about what fairness means, what bias means in this context. What does it mean for a system to be fair? And it turned out that there are multiple conflicting definitions of fairness. Then from that mathematical lens, people could go back to the societal questions and say, oh, what does this mean for society if we're using one of these kinds of the assumptions behind one of these metrics versus the assumptions behind a different one of these metrics. So I think that by looking at the algorithmic system, by looking at the biases, by looking at the flaws and risks there, that can be a lens to help us look at the flaws in the broader societal system, which is the first step towards trying to address those things.
But what's interesting there is that, like in the jury system, in the bail system, in the welfare system, in a lot of these algorithmic systems, there's almost no way for an individual who's been affected to challenge them, which makes them unfair from the get-go. Yeah. But in this case, when we're talking about declassification, and we're talking about, say, FOIA requests from a journalist, how are those decisions going to be challenged? Where does the challenge come in? Who is going to moderate, essentially, those challenges? How fast can they happen? I mean, are we actually about to set up a system that actually is going to slow things down inherently? So, I think that when we're talking about these systems, we have to be talking about how we institute fairness, how we institute a system of challenges that doesn't break the system as it sort of is being developed. I don't know if you guys have thoughts about that, but.
Yeah, and I think that, whether you can live with the consequences depend on so many number of factors, right? So imagine that you run the pilot that Hanna proposed, right? Like you realize, okay, this is likely to be the impact of running this stack of documents through a generative AI model that has been instructed with machine optimized guidelines to recommend whether the material should stay declassified or not. The pilot will tell you, well, you can do that. It will fast forward your process by 25 years. You're also very likely to over-declassify by 5%. And then maybe Carmen takes this and says, I think we can live with that because we're in a different society now. Those are all sort of like trade-offs that are going to be imperfect approximation of what is likely to happen, and then ultimately a human decision on, sure, I'll take 10%. I don't think that this corpus has a lot of high severity risk within it. And I think we can live with it to save 25 years of analyst work. I don't know. I think so much of that ends up being, again, like subjective assessment on probabilistic outcomes.
Carmen earlier had referenced the State Department pilot program when they were trying to look at declassified cables and build a system to see whether or not it was accurate. And I think they looked at the cables from 1997. And the outcome was that they were correct. The machines and the humans were sort of in alignment about 97% of the time, which sounds like a lot. But my question is, what about that 3%? Are we willing to live with a system that is imperfect, or are we willing to say, okay, an imperfect system at least will get us this much farther towards our goal of making state secrets more transparent and, essentially supporting democracy?
Well, in the panel this morning, I forget his name, but he made the comment that transparency of information is not the only thing that can restore legitimacy in government, that there are several other pathologies in the US political system that have led for people to have less trust in government. But certainly it is one of the contributing factors to people having less trust in government, this idea that the government keeps secrets and is conspiring, et cetera, et cetera. So, whether or not we can live with the 3% error rate, I think has to be judged with what are the values and objectives that we're trying to achieve. Sometimes when I think about, I don't know if this is going to work, but I'm going to go for it. Sometimes when I think about classification as an issue, almost none of what we are classifying is actually hidden, right? So, the omniscient being will see the Israeli jet flying to Iran and then coming back. It's not actually hidden, right? So we're kind of hung up. What digital technology, I believe, has done is make everything in the world much more visible than it ever was. And not only just visible, but like permanently visible. Like you will have that record forever and ever and ever. And now we're hung up on, well, we have to keep secret the documents, and the only thing these documents do is simply record what was visible. Is that making any sense to you all? So I'm actually just questioning, and I am the CIA person up here, I am just questioning the logic of secrecy writ large. And when I was at CIA, one of my favorite jokes was the CIA is going to be the last secret organization in the world, and it's never a good thing to be the last of anything. So I'm not sure if my point got across, but I definitely believe that it is foolish to strive for perfection. You know, it used to be that the phrase "good enough for government work" was a compliment. No, I'm serious. Was a compliment that back in the late 19th, earliest 20th century, when the government became a bigger part of life, the phrase "this is good enough for government was a compliment. That what you're doing, that is a consistent enough level for government to adopt it. Now, it's a criticism. But I think it should just be accepted as reality. It's good enough for government work.
And I think I want to pick up on your question about let's say we do have a system, let's say it's 97% accurate. Are we okay with that sort of 3% of errors? I think this is always going to be the question that we have to ask with AI systems, right? What level of performance is sufficient, is good enough? And that's a very, very hard question to answer because it depends on so many different things. First, how are you defining performance? What do you actually mean by performance here? When you're looking at that 97%, very specifically, what are you actually calculating? And then even assuming that you do have a good notion of performance, then there's the question of what is the system getting wrong, right? Because different types of errors are going to have different risk profiles. And so then error analysis becomes really, really important. What is in that 3%? What is not in that 3%? If these are the types of places where we're making that 3% of errors, are we okay with that? And to go back to the comments earlier about algorithmic systems and fairness, for example, if your data points correspond to people, are you making mistakes for data points that are particularly associated with one group of people? That's probably something that we really don't want. Whereas if your mistakes are more randomly distributed, maybe we're more okay with that, even if it's the same level of mistakes. So I think this is where we can't give clear answers without really digging in, without doing that error analysis, and then without, again, taking into account the socio-technical context. What are the implications and impacts of those particular errors? Who's going to be impacted? In what way? Are we okay with those people being impacted? To tie it back to something you said earlier, will those people have any kind of recourse? Will they be able to contest these decisions? And these are really the questions that we have to answer, and they're hard questions in order to answer that question of, are we okay with 97% performance?
They're hard questions, but we're starting to have templates to do the
absolutely. Yeah.
I want to sort of continue on the sort of, thoughts that Carmen put out there and talk about, like, while, some folks are thinking through, like, can we properly use AI to work on declassification? Like, what's happening on the other side of the world? And sort of, the rest of how technology is being used is undoubtedly that a lot of people will turn to generative AI to produce classified information. Mm-hmm. They will try to retrieve classified information from training data. As we talked about, the people who operate those systems will not be in a position to say whether that's indeed classified information or not. They will produce fake classified information, sometimes because it's fun, sometimes because they have nefarious intent. They will seek to distribute it. They might even produce dangerous information. There's a lot of conversation on, can you produce born secret information with AI systems? And I think that justifies thinking about, in an environment in which that becomes much more accessible, what is the right posture and set of messages around this very idea of navigating classification in an environment in which I think this is, like, again, like, we'll have more people trying to retrieve some, creating some fake ones, and more and more people really enabled to help figure out what is what's real and what's not. So you have all this real classified material waiting to be declassified, and then maybe in 2 years we'll have a huge pile of maybe fake, maybe real classified material, maybe retrieved, maybe made up, floating around on social networks. That's not going to be fun either.
Right. Yep.
So I want to do the journalist trick. And the journalist trick is, because we're getting close to the time when we're going to stop and you're going to start asking questions. The journalist trick is, at the end of every interview, is to ask the person that they're interviewing, what didn't I ask you and what do you want to say? And so let's just go down, and that is the question, and let's just go down. Let's start with Carmen.
Well, golly, what didn't you ask me? What do I want to say? Classification system is broken. The classification system reflects assumptions we make about how we want to govern ourselves and our society. And that is what we really should be paying attention to and I believe the next panels are going to address some of those questions, where it all begins. And then I just want everyone, and I think people in the national security community need to do this, is to actually ask themselves hard questions about the value of secrecy and these inane and Byzantine classification systems. I think that should all be up for reinvention.
You haven't asked me if open source systems pose more risk within this context. And some people have argued that. Some people have argued you can turn to generative AI and to those chatbots, for instance, to create very dangerous information on nuclear weapons. And as a result, we want only big tech like OpenAI or Google to be able to provide those AI systems because they can build safeguards that when users will turn and say, oh, please teach me how to do a biochemical attack, the system will say, nope, we're not doing that today. And is this real? And is this a good reason to say, therefore, they shouldn't be open source systems? I think that so far, people who've looked seriously into this risk will tell you that what matters when we evaluate the risks of those AI systems is this concept of marginal risk. Open systems so far haven't found to be marginally more risky than closed system or than the rest of available technologies like, searching Google. And I think that what we're facing is an environment where nobody actually knows how to do robust safeguards. And I love Microsoft, but OpenAI also doesn't have robust safeguards. And last time, for instance, we had a very public moment of media meltdown around the abuse of an AI system. The Taylor Swift pornographic AI-generated imagery is a good example of that. People said, oh, this has got to be some rogue open system. No, it was made on a Microsoft system because the safeguard was very easy to go around. And so I think that having this sort of conversation, thinking about, again, what's the marginal risk versus all the other systems that exist, and what is our collective responsibility as a field, as a set of stakeholders coming from different places to think about what does it mean to really make robust safety safeguard and to distribute it across all projects is a question that we haven't solved yet.
But are we going to solve it before we create these systems or not?
Oh, they're already deployed.
Right.
The systems are there. So yeah, there's a little bit of urgency to your point.
Right.
Let's see. So I'm not sure this is what you haven't asked me necessarily, but I think there are 2 points that I want to sort of emphasize. So one point is this point that I think is really important. If we have a broken system within our society, something like that, we can't assume that simply putting tech into that mix is somehow going to magically fix everything. Instead, we should be viewing this as a socio-technical system and asking really hard questions about that system that we're inserting tech into, possibly even using tech to direct those questions that we're asking, and then trying to think about how we can improve the entire socio-technical system. I think that if we view the problem as just the system is broken, let's throw in tech, that's going to fix it, we're not going to succeed. But But I also want to emphasize that this isn't unique to studying the government classification system. This is one of the fundamental questions with AI and society. You take society that has all its flaws and weaknesses and broken things and stuff like that. You get a bunch of people who say, oh my gosh, we can fix this with AI, but simply just throwing some AI in there and hoping for the best isn't going to cut it. Instead, you need to think about that socio-technical system that you're building. So I think one of the things that really excites me about this panel discussion we've been having is that although we have been talking about the government classification system and the role of AI there, we are actually talking about the role of AI within society.
Yes.
And so many of the points that we've brought up here extend beyond the government classification system. So that was point number one. Point number two, look, I'm a scientist, right? And as a scientist, I like thinking about obtaining information, obtaining evidence, obtaining data, things like that. And in this context, I think that means that we probably need to be doing more experiments. So experiments that look at the current government classification system and the humans in it, the system itself, to try to actually understand the properties of the current system. Then once we've done that, that tells us something about that broken system, but something real rather than, well, I think this, well, I think that, these kinds of things. Moreover, we can then start to do similar experiments involving the socio-technical system and introducing AI into there. So I would encourage people, rather than just thinking about this as being a scenario where we can just proceed to build something and kind of see what happens, to instead ground that in doing these careful experiments to really understand kind of what we are going to be able to do, what we're not going to be able to do, and kind of what we're up against.
Right, thank you. So it's time for all of you to ask questions, and there are microphones that are coming around.
Hi, thank you. My name is Jack, and I'm a Foreign Service Officer with the U.S. State Department, seconded to SIPA for the academic year. Thank you for mentioning about states' pilot programs. We do have a pilot program for chat that will focus on translations and summaries of treaties and white papers. I was chosen as a beta tester probably because state wants to figure out how an idiot interacts with large language models. But without a computer science background and with all of your experiences, what would you recommend to a beta tester to engage with a very limited large language model set without getting me fired for asking the model to make naked pictures of people?
I'll leave that up to you guys.
I can take a first stab. Recently, IGP hosted a great conversation with Dr. Alondra Nelson, who ran a project essentially beta testing how chatbots answer questions on electoral integrity. And she did this bringing in actual folks involved in organizing state elections and testing, asking questions on like, how do I register to vote? Or how do I volunteer for, open ballots or whatever? And what was fascinating is to have the subject matter experts look at the answer and talk about what were the implications of getting it wrong in a way that no abstract computer scientist could have never understood. And so I remember, for instance, I helped facilitate some of that testing. I remember, for instance, an answer that said, if you wish to volunteer to help with the election, it's a very lengthy process, and you have to be fluent in English, and you must, do it months in advance. And I remember, seeing the election official being like, oh my God, this is so wrong. It's actually not the right. It's actually not true. We're looking for bilingual volunteers too, but also we always need people the day off. And that extra layer of context, which is not only like, I know why this is wrong, but I know why this matters and the impact that this may have on democracy, I think is really something that we must learn to sort of facilitate from, what you call beta testers, sometimes we call red teamers, sometimes we call expert review, is this sense that really computer scientists will never get of like, why is this information wrong? And more importantly, why is this impactful for what we're trying to do? So there's so much value, I think, in participating in those programs and bringing a different lens and an expert lens.
Thank you very much. My name is Maria, and my question would be for Hanna, and it has to do with that 3% that you just talked about.
Yeah.
And maybe using, this is a little bit controversial, but I know that there's been a lot of use of synthetic data, but also can we use synthetic data dynamically to heal these systems and these existing algorithms, especially in something as sensitive as national security data?
Yeah, so there are a lot of people who look at using synthetic data in a variety of different contexts.
Could you define what synthetic
Oh, yeah,
is?
sure.
I'm not,
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Okay, so normally when we train an AI system, we take a whole bunch of data from the real world and we use that data to train our AI system. So our AI system is then learning patterns from that data set that comes from the real world. However, you can also generate data that didn't come from the real world via some process that looks kind of like real world data, so it has some similar properties to real world data, and do this to augment your data set of real world data so that you then have more data with which to train your system. And people investigate doing this for things like, suppose you have a very limited number of data points of one particular type within your data set. You might generate some synthetic data points that also have that type so that you have a more balanced data set, these kinds of things. I think in this context, and I should say, people have used synthetic data in a variety of different settings. In some settings, it's been helpful. In other settings, it's been less helpful. And I think there's still a ton of open questions around synthetic data and where it helps and where it's less helpful. And what do we do as the balance of synthetic data? Sort of, you end up with more synthetic data and sort of comparatively less real world data. There's a bunch of all of these questions, and I'm not going to sort of get into that. I think for me, though, thinking about this particular setting is what would we be wanting to generate here? What type of synthetic data would we be wanting to generate? Well, probably we're going to want to generate some kinds of documents or information. And we're probably going to want to generate either documents that look like documents that have already been declassified, or we're going to want to generate documents that look like documents that we would want to keep classified. Now, I think, at least based on my understanding of the situation, I suspect that we already have a lot of access to documents that have been declassified. And so it's probably not going to be those that we're going to want to be generating. It's probably then documents that look like documents that should be kept classified. But if we don't have a lot of data about documents that should be kept classified, it's going to be really hard to generate ones that look realistic. So I think for me, this sort of raises some questions about whether synthetic data would be valuable here. Again, I should give the disclaimer that I haven't particularly thought about this before in this particular context. And so it is totally possible that actually there is some very specific reason in which it would be possible and would be very valuable. But when I think about this just, sort of at first blush, it seems to me that it would be most useful to generate synthetic documents that look like the ones you want to keep secret. And that's going to be really hard to do unless you have a lot of those documents that you access to a lot of those documents that you want to keep secret.
I will just say, if you endeavor to create a bunch of fake government secret, this is going to be a trove for the next big conspiracy theory. And
absolutely,
I would want to see those. That could be really fun or terrible, depending on how this goes.
Thank you. My name is Cynthia. I guess we're not giving last names here. Is there a security reason for that?
Definitely.
We'll generate a last name for you.
So I'm a professor and academic. Thank you for generating that. A few years ago, I was in the reverse position as our State Department visitor here in serving in government in the Joint Staff. And one of my roles was to avoid all sorts of drudgery, but nonetheless, everyone was responsible for spending a little time in declassifying documents in a process that had many restrictions, many guidelines, and I would have welcomed AI as someone who uses AI extensively to run through homeworks I assign students to see what it could generate, and so on. And one question that follows from that is, the team I worked on had physicists, international relations experts, other kinds of subject matter experts. Why not, would there be people at a place like Microsoft be willing to spend a year in government, get the necessary security clearances, do service to their country, as others of us have tried to do, and solve the problem of having the expertise needed in computer science? I know there's been resistance in Google and other companies about doing government work, but that's one solution. Frankly, I think this is a quaint conversation because it would seem clear to me that it would be immensely helpful, and the 3%, assuming this is going to get a lot better, and the last year I've been using AI, the improvements and the diminishment in hallucination has been remarkable, and that's just over the course of 1 year. The second quick comment I want to make is why this conversation is troublesome is that I also work on nuclear issues, and the idea of AI in nuclear is truly frightening. But it's, for working in the United States, where I have faith in our system and humans in the loop, what worries me is less the United States than, say, China or Russia or North Korea, countries that are also engaged in this kind of technology. And you think back into the Cold War, there was already an example of an effort by the Soviet Union, Varian, to plug into a computer a surprise attack predictive model that actually frightened the Kremlin into believing that the US and NATO were going to use nuclear weapons, and had very adverse effects. A very primitive system, but they used it. And now our adversaries may be more willing to engage and use their AI models without the kinds of context concerns that we're more likely to bring. So what's your sense, maybe this is directed to Hanna, but also to Carmen, of their progress, and what can we do about it? Thanks.
Yeah, so firstly, to your first question, I can't speak for everybody within Microsoft, but yes, I would imagine there would be people who would be very interested in doing that. One of the things that I personally like about being at Microsoft is that we do have a bunch of people who come from a variety of different backgrounds themselves and who are really interested in doing interdisciplinary work. So within Microsoft Research, I'm a computer scientist, but we have a bunch of social scientists. We have people with biology backgrounds. We have people with chemistry backgrounds. And I think many of us gravitate towards Microsoft because we'd rather be at a place with a whole bunch of interdisciplinary backgrounds than, in my case, being at a computer science department with a bunch of other computer scientists. So I think there are a lot of people who see the value in that kind of interdisciplinary work and would potentially be interested in doing what you're talking about. I also believe, and everything I'm about to say, I'm probably going to get all the details wrong, but I believe there is some program within Microsoft, it might just be for folks in research, but it might be for other folks, where you can take time off to go spend time doing things in government. I can't remember, again, whether there are specific types of things that this is for, but there's already a little bit of precedent there. So yeah, I think this is absolutely something that people would be interested in. And then for your second comment, look, people are really worried about all of these kinds of risks. So chemical weapons, biological weapons, nuclear, all of this kind of stuff. And I'm seeing many companies really leaning into thinking seriously about these CBRN risks that people are so concerned about at the moment. I will say that when I got into this space, I was like, well, we know how we're developing our models. We know how, all of this kind of stuff. So, maybe studying this will be relatively easy. And people immediately brought up, no, you have to think about what happens when, let's say models built by US companies get into the hands of other countries, all of this kind of stuff. Similarly, what can we conclude about models that are built in other countries? These are really big questions, and I think these are things that many people are grappling with at the moment. I don't have any easy answers, but I don't have any easy answers about any of this. I think that is just the nature of this, this space.
So 20 years ago, just to comment on your question, I was talking to a group of analysts at CIA who their job was to follow Chinese technology development. And I went up to them and I asked them, because they tended to make fun of or demean the potential of China. So I asked them the question, I said, what will happen? And they were always accusing the Chinese of stealing our technology. And I said, what will happen when the Chinese have the lead on a technology and we will want to steal theirs? And I kid you not, their answer was, that'll never happen. And I walked away from that conversation not very happy. Wow. Because down that path lies disaster, right? So the Chinese certainly are involved in quite an experiment on combining humans and technologies across many domains. So,
we have time for one very, very quick question. It's not up to me. I guess it is up to me. Right over there.
Okay. Anyway, this morning's panel and this afternoon's panel is primarily focused on covert security organizations. No one's really brought up the most overt one, which is the United States Postal Service, because that's really a holder. It goes back close to 300 years. Since the mid-1980s, they've been scanning first-class letters, not the interior, but the addressees. So you have a whole database there, too, of, so if someone, let's say, was planning a terrorism thing, wouldn't John Smith in New York writing a letter to John Doe in Chicago, wouldn't, for example, the CIA want to know that? And other than no, they wouldn't, okay.
U.S. citizens, we would not want to know that.
Right. But wouldn't someone want to know it? Other than for marketing purposes?
All right. Thank you all. This was fantastic. I want you to note that we have a single-sex panel here talking about national security and technology.
Thank you all so much. That was fascinating. We have a 15-minute break, so stretch your legs, recaffeinate, etc. And we'll be back at 2:45 for the third panel. Thanks so much.